The conflict in the Gulf is reverberating through energy markets worldwide. Disruptions around the Strait of Hormuz, a key choke point for 1/5 of the world's oil and gas, are tightening supplies and driving up prices. As a result, energy security has become central to how global leaders are weighing policy responses and considering the risks of further escalation. I'd like to welcome you all to Baker Briefing, where we make the news make sense. I'm David Satterfield, director of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Since the U.S. and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran on February 28th, just 1 month ago, the situation in the region has evolved rapidly. Many experts describe it as one of the most significant global energy security challenges in decades. But how accurate is that assessment? What does it mean for markets, governments, and consumers worldwide? Today, we're going to be examining how the war in Iran is affecting energy, how countries are responding, and what the evolving dynamics mean for the global economy in the weeks and months ahead. And I'm joined today by Ken Medlock, director of the Baker Institute Center for Energy Studies. We have a lot to discuss, so I look forward, Ken, to getting to it. But I'd like to start by asking you, how are the markets responding? How are they pricing in different degrees? What's happening? Where do you expect it will go?
That's a great question. There also seems to be a lot of uncertainty about the answer to that question, which is why it's a great question. I've heard many times statements to the effect of markets are mispricing risk. I have to tell you that's nonsense. What markets are actually doing is internalizing physical detail about supply and demand in real time, literally every second of every day. So when you see what's actually happening in the market with regard to spot price, particularly in the crude oil market and increasingly in natural gas market, you're talking about one of the most fungible, globally liquid commodities on the planet. So the amount of information that is constantly being fed to traders it's unparalleled. So make no mistake, balance that you see in the current market environment is about market clearing. It is about where certain number of barrels that are available actually can be consumed and at what price that clears. Now, we are seeing a very asymmetric impact across the global commodity space, in particular in the oil space. Just 2 days ago, the price of Kuwaiti blend, which is part of the OPEC basket, settled at $163 a barrel. That's a really big number. And of course, that set off alarm bells about, well, does that mean Brent will rise to 163? No, it does not. One of the kind of more interesting things you're seeing in the global oil commodity space happens all the time in natural gas markets and in electric power markets. Namely, you'll see regional price dislocations because you have constraints on the ability to move a particular commodity from A to B. Now, obviously, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the effective closure, is creating a very binding constraint. And the demand for Kuwaiti blend hasn't disappeared. It's still there. It just so happens that those blends typically arrive at Asian refineries where they're then refined and turned into all the products that are used. And those refineries aren't necessarily tuned for other blends of crude, and they can't logistically maneuver to grab other types of crude to displace that. So you're seeing a capacity constraint that's driving up the Kuwaiti blend price relative to the Brent price or the WTI price. Now, how do we see this playing out in the market? Well, some refiners have actually cut runs. You can refer to that as rationing, if you like. And that rationing is effectively like shifting the demand curve in at every price. And so when you start to see that happen more and more, given that you've got a binding capacity constraint, so supply, in other words, is perfectly vertical, price comes down very quickly. And what did we see over the last 2 days? Well, the Kuwaiti blend actually settled down from 163 by about $38 just yesterday, right? So you're going to see a lot of volatility in those highly constrained markets. How long will this last? What will this mean for Brent? What will this mean for WTI? Well, currently, the Asian market is much more constrained than the Atlantic Basin market. You actually see this in the way the whipsaw we're seeing in pricing. So for a while now, and this is a generalization because there's been a few days where this has not been true, but for a while now, you've seen overnight trading driving up crude oil prices, even at Brent and WTI. But then when the European and the U.S. desks open, those prices come back down. And that's because the physical barrels, the physical market reality in the Atlantic Basin is different than it is in the Pacific Basin right now. Basically, what this amounts to is there is a severe lack of physical liquidity in the Pacific Basin. There is not in the Atlantic Basin. Now, how does this manifest? Well, you might think you'd start shifting lighter barrels out of the Atlantic Basin to the Pacific Basin. That's not a simple 5-day move. That's a 30-plus day move, right? So it takes a while to redirect tankers. You might also think that you'd see an increase in exports of petroleum products, because at the end of the day, it's not about the oil, it's about the product that you refine the oil into. And you have seen that. You've actually seen an increase in refining run rates in Europe. You've seen an increase in refinery run rates in the United States with the explicit purpose of producing products that can be shipped abroad. That, of course, does have implications for the price at the pump in the United States and the price at the petrol station in Europe. But it's not quite the same as a highly constrained marketplace where you see $163 for one of the OPEC blends. So the market always finds ways to flex into the price signals that it receives. And the oil market is very good at that because it is so deep and so liquid. So it's something we cannot forget when we're thinking about what the market implications of all of this are. The oil market will continue to settle. What's been really interesting, and I saw finally probably the best interview I've seen on Bloomberg yesterday morning about this issue. What about the structure of the forward curve? Because this is where most of what's reported and what you'll see on the ticker is the 1 month ahead price, right? It's not the spot price. You can access the spot price through various sources, but the 1 month ahead price is really where the financial market is settling. And the majority of the trades around that market are paper trades. They're not actually physical barrels. So the report yesterday that I saw was really interesting because I had been asked this actually prior to a spot I did on BBC, and I don't have access to what are called commitment of traders reports in real time. You have to be a trader to have access to that. You can typically get that with a week to a month delay, right? But the report was talking to somebody who's the head of a trading desk, one of the big trading shops that I'll sort of leave the names out. But they said that the net length for the financial players, so this is hedge funds and banks, in the oil space, particularly around Brent and WTI, was 11-1. So that means you're net long or you have a net buy position that outweighs your sell positions 11-1. That is massive for anybody that doesn't understand what that means. Effectively, there's no more length in the market, in the financial market. Now, what's happening in response to that? You're seeing the physical traders selling barrels into that length as fast as they can. So what that means is the physical players are seeing this price signal and they're trying to sell into it because it's a very high price, and it's actually led to the forward curve, instead of being steep backwardated in steep backwardation, flattening. Now, what are you going to see as a result of that? You're going to actually see, as traders sell into that, physical traders, they're going to see their companies start to take actions to put rigs to work. And you're going to see responses in the physical barrel space over the next 30 days that will begin to lift more crude. Now, this is where things get potentially interesting, because you can lock in that price as a physical trader for a long period of time and bring more crude into the market, right? Well, that 11-1 net long position is dangerous for financial commodity players. It's a speculative position, and it's pricing in risk. It's effectively goes back to how we started this whole conversation, right? But all it's going to take is one large financial position to think, okay, it's time to unwind. And as soon as they do, you will see herd mentality, and the back end of the forward curve will drop like a rock. And that is going to put us in a really interesting position where we potentially, as we move into the second half of this year, are faced with another oversupply condition. So just keep that in mind, because what you tend to see in these kind of really wild, highly constrained marketplaces are swings that the physical market will always respond to. It just doesn't happen instantaneously, but it is happening. So try not to get too caught up in the day-to-day or hour-to-hour movements in what is a financial market indicator in terms of the WTI and the Brent price that you see on the forwards. It's more about what is the physical market doing, and that's not always the easiest thing to see, but the information is out there, and try to absorb that as much as possible.
As you look at previous prices in the market, 08, 09, a prolonged period of instability, 11 to 14, and then again, 21, 22. What did you see?
So that's also a great question, because you've probably all heard the two words demand destruction over the last couple of days if you've been following all of this. A lot of questions about when will that happen. So first of all, as an economist, to me, demand destruction does not mean walking up a demand curve and sort of allowing price elasticity to impact how much is ultimately being consumed. Demand destruction is more of a structural issue. This is where you actually retire capital, and when you retire capital, you don't ever return to where you were before. You're not seeing that right now. In fact, from 2010 to 2015, we saw every single year for that window of 5.5 years, roughly, if we go on a monthly basis, the average price of oil was over $100 a barrel. And that was just a steady sort of new normal, if you will. And by the way, there is no such thing as normal in oil markets, but that was a steady new normal that everybody started to talk about. And then, of course, the wheels fell off and price dropped. But the interesting thing about that is we did not see demand destruction in the 2010 to 2015 time horizon. We actually saw global demand increase by 7 million barrels a day over that period. So you fast forward to 2022, we saw price spike up in the wake of actually just before Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then again there was a double peak, right? Right. So we saw prices climbing when we were coming out of COVID. That was just general supply chain stress, and then with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we saw a sort of double spike, and price then at Brent jumped up to just over $122 a barrel. So that's higher than what we've hit so far in this current circumstance. Did we see demand destruction then? No, we didn't. In fact, we saw demand from 21 to 22 increase by about 1.7 million barrels a day, and then from 22 to 23, in the height of everything that was going on with Russia and Ukraine at the outset of that conflict, demand jumped by almost another 2 million barrels a day. So you have to think about recent history and what it has actually revealed with regard to demand for the products that we typically use on a daily basis and where it's coming from before you start stepping into demand destruction discussions. And I think there's a lot of that not happening right now.
So, Ken, let's start with some postulates. Let's assume this crisis at some point, whether it is next week, a month from now, ends. By ends means the Strait of Hormuz opens again for free traffic, just as before. The states producing in the Gulf can resume that production, but with some deficits. Kuwait, Bahrain, and most notably Qatar have taken hits to their production. In Qatar's case, a significant one to two of the gas trains at Ras Laffan. Talk to us about the latency, if there is any, in the global gas market to make up for that drop in Qatar's ability to produce.
As most of you might know, there were strikes at Ras Laffan that have led to a reduction in capacity projected reduction of capacity, about 17% of what the facility can produce. That's roughly 12 to 13 million tons a year. So that's a big number. The global LNG market is a market that has been developed because of its capital intensity so that supply generally just matches demand, right? And so you continue to expand and you don't really see a lot of spare capacity in the LNG market. And so this is literally a punch in the face, particularly for Asian buyers. Layer into that the fact that with the closure of the strait, Qatari flows have no other way out. In fact, when you look at the amount of supply between Qatar and UAE, last year, that was roughly 80 million tons. That is about 20% of the global LNG market. That is huge. There is no immediate replacement. You typically adapt to those kinds of stresses by fuel switching. So you're going to see countries like China lean more heavily into coal. They did this, in fact, in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because that's where a lot of that LNG is ultimately destined. But then you see other stress points in like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. They don't have any other path out of this, and they don't have any other spare flexibility in their grids, and so it really creates a lot of stress in those countries. What will happen as we move forward if the strait were to open? Well, you're still down that 17%. But Qatar Energy actually did a really interesting thing by entering into a joint venture with Exxon to build Golden Pass, which is over near Sabine Pass. It's an LNG export terminal from the U.S. that, from what I understand, is entering or has already entered its commissioning phase. So it will be able to begin to deliver from its first train, which is about 6 million tons imminently. The second train is scheduled to open at some point later this year. When it opens later this year, that's another 6 million tons. So notice, if you do the math, we're talking about 12 million tons that's going to come out of the Golden Pass terminal. So that effectively offsets in about a 9-month window the lost long-term capacity reduction that we're seeing at Ras Laffan. Where's the lesson in this? It's not that the market will settle back down to a lower price in terms of the international marketplace. So European and Asian LNG prices are going to remain relatively high, particularly as we move through the injection season. So Europe is facing another bit of a crisis because it's going to need gas to refill storage for next winter. But I feel like we've kind of played the script before. We know what will happen. They'll outbid others, and China will switch to coal, and you'll sort of see that market bounce. Again, markets are very flexible. But as you look longer term and what Qatar Energy actually did with regard to that horizontal diversification, I would expect to see more of that in terms of Arab Gulf producers to the extent they can. That's just one example of de-risking through flexing greater resiliency. So I think you'll see some significant shifts on the back end of this with regard to investments made to diversify routes out of the region. So Saudi Arabia, for those of you who don't know, you might have heard about the East-West pipeline that moves across the Arabian Peninsula. They took steps to commission and develop that after the overthrow of the Shah in Iran in 1979. That opened in the early 1980s with a design capacity of 5 million barrels a day. Certainly not enough to move all of the oil that they produce, but you have the ability to flush the NGL lines that run parallel to it and increase that capacity up to 7 million barrels a day. And it's been done. And in fact, they demonstrated its feasibility after the attacks at Cake several years ago. 2019. So they've shown what the ability to flex and diversify flows out mean. And in fact, given the price escalation you've seen just since the onset of the Arab Light was closed yesterday at like 103, I think, right? Dollars a barrel. That's up from before the conflict started, close to 70. Which effectively means if you're moving 7 million barrels a day, you can just do the math at a plus $30 a barrel increment. You've paid for all that infrastructure in 3 weeks. Just think about that, right? So it's an interesting lesson in what can be done through diversification. So I fully expect, and even Baghdad and the KRG set aside differences to reopen the Kirkuk-Ceyhan pipeline and started loading about 250,000 a day right there. But necessity is the mother of invention, and you're going to see a lot of interest in diversifying export routes out of the region. Where Kuwait fits into this, because they are truly bottlenecked. They don't have access to any pipeline capacity out. They've effectively shut in their production. They need the strait, just like Qatar needs the strait. Long term, I think you might see some dialogues open up between the Kuwaitis and the Saudis to reinvest in the Trans-Arabian pipeline corridor, which gets you out to the Mediterranean as well. That was a corridor that was closed in 1990, but it is all the feasibility study, the understanding of what needs to happen. It's already done, right? There's a legacy there. But I fully expect that sovereign wealth funds in the region will also be heavily focused on developing alternative routes out.
Okay, and let me pivot slightly from that discussion of Kuwait and sovereign wealth funds to a broad comment on the economic stability, well-being of the states most affected, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states themselves, by this conflict from an economic standpoint. And the answer is they're affected, but not really in terms of daily life. All of these countries, even Bahrain and especially Kuwait, have built the capacity without reliance for periods of time on hydrocarbon exports to be able to maintain all of the services of government, all of the necessities of purchasing goods for populations. I see the reporting on all of this. Nobody is in a situation in the Gulf right now where they cannot bring in necessary commodities and when they cannot afford to provide services. Now, that can change if escalation takes place in the character of the campaign away from the present threat at hydrocarbon infrastructure to civil infrastructure. If you see a more opposite case to Ukraine, where the targeting is at electricity, power generation, supply lines for water, for power, heating, these are all critical and so far untouched areas, and one other, desalination, which is highly vulnerable and on which virtually every country we are speaking of relies absolutely for conduct of normal life. That has not been a target of Iran yet, and it is why the reaction to the Israeli strike on the South Pars gas processing plant was as immediate as it was, which is cut this out. Because Iran immediately said, well, this is going to be your targeting, or the reaction to the president's, I guess, 6 or 7 hours in which our policy was to strike electrical power generation before that was walked away from, Iran said, fine, go to town. We'll respond against similar infrastructure in the Gulf. And I would note, because it's an interesting marker, Ken, Qatar has not been targeted by either drones or missiles, only state in the region, since the 19th of March. Clearly, some form of deal was done there in which Israel won't strike electrical power generating facilities in Iran. Qatar isn't going to be hit either. I suspect there is a 2 or 3-way or 4-way dialogue that took place there to exempt Qatar from this problem. All of which takes us to the issue of what happens if there is no clear resolution. If this goes on not for a week or 2, but 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, does any of your analysis shift at that point?
Well, I think the long-term analysis doesn't change. There still will be an effort to flex into diversified pathways out. I think what becomes more in question is what is the damage assessment post-conflict? So once we actually see with clarity what's been hit, what's been damaged, how long it will take to repair it, we'll have a better understanding of what it means for oil and gas markets. Now, here's where I think it's really important to point another thing out that has only begun to get attention, which is it's not just about oil and gas. Something like 30,000 ships traverse the Strait of Hormuz on an annual basis, which accounts for roughly 11% of global maritime trade. That is massive. That's something that nobody's really been talking about yet. 30% of the world's helium supply traverses the Strait of Hormuz. And a lot of people who aren't aware of what helium is used for, its industrial applications, think that just means we're not going to have helium to put in party balloons, right? That's not what it means. Helium is a non-substitutable input into semiconductor fabrication. You're already seeing concerns voiced by the semiconductor manufacturing industry that they might have to declare force majeure for delivery of product orders. Why point this out? And having gotten to sulfur yet, and nitrogen, which is where you get into agriculture and fertilizer. So these are all important, arteries for those commodities. It's all through the strait, right? But there's been a lot of discussion. Well, this just verifies we need to get off of fossil fuels and just move to renewables. And I can see at its face value that sounds like a nice thing to say, but you have to understand how integrated the supply chains for renewables are with the oil and gas industry. Because where do you think helium comes from? It actually comes from natural gas development. So if you stop developing natural gas, where do you get the helium for semiconductor fabrication? That's a really important question, and nobody seems to want to reconcile the supply chains for all of these energy commodities, and they are all intimately linked. So that just reinforces the need for diversification of routes out and how important in the near term the strait actually is for all forms of energy, not just for oil and gas. Agriculture is negatively impacted. Most of the sulfur and nitrogenous fertilizer feedstocks that come out of the strait are not really coming to the US or the Atlantic basin. It's Africa, it's South Asia. It has implications that are global.
And implications that are even more dramatic because of the dramatic cutoff of fertilizer supplies out of Ukraine that attended the beginning of that conflict. East Africa has been in the midst of an historic agricultural collapse and drought for years now, contributing to the inability to come back out of that spiral has been a global shortage of fertilizer. Sounds like a basic commodity, must be available everywhere. No, it's not.
That's exactly right. So I'm going to turn the question back to you.
All right.
If we think about if this drags on for another 3, 4, 5 weeks, and I've heard people kind of transitioning from days to weeks to months, right?
Mhm.
If this does drag on, what is the state of play? What are the options for actors in the region in terms of engagement with the U.S. and even with each other?
The longer this goes on, the more difficult it becomes for the principal non-Iranian actor, who is one individual, President Trump. It's not Bibi Netanyahu, it's President Trump, to find an exit strategy, an off-ramp. Why does it become more complex? Because of a very unfortunate growing negative political curve. Iran's growing, not diminishing confidence that they've won and that they will be strengthened in a paradoxical fashion when this conflict ends. Now, how can I say that given the graphic images of genuine, quantifiable destruction proceeding over these 4 weeks and likely for some time to come of targets, whether the infrastructure associated in the country with the security forces, the Republican Guard Corps, the Basij, the police, the destruction of the Iranian Navy, Air Force, air defense system, missile production facilities, all on that supply chain, storage facilities for missiles, including underground secure storage areas, launchers. All of that's real. It's certainly not made up. But what is the strategic impact on Iran's ability to project threat, risk in the region, but particularly against the Gulf states, and to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed? And the answer is zero to date. I was in a conversation at CERAWeek yesterday morning with a former senior EUCOM military official whose comment was, "You're taught in basic doctrine school. Tactics don't substitute for strategy. You have seen extraordinary tactics applied by the Israeli Defense Forces, by the U.S. military. Exceptional, just phenomenal work. Strategically, though, what Iran needs to continue to present a meaningful strategic threat that closes the strait, that threatens the hydrocarbon infrastructure for now, maybe civil infrastructure in some future escalation of its Gulf neighbors, put Israel out of the picture for the moment, remains intact. Can a continued kinetic aerial campaign, this is the big question right now, can that continued campaign, projected over another week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, reduce to a strategic level Iran's capacities, having watched campaigns like this firsthand in the combat area over decades? No, I am not convinced it can be done. This is a huge country, enormous country, with a vast reservoir of security forces, survivability down first, second, third, and fourth tier leadership that's built in, baked in to the system. It's anticipated that leadership will be decapitated. That's not a problem set. It's anticipated as part of what you can expect. They have a survivability. And in the missile and drone field, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, which have been very blunt-spoken about what they've done, have just stated within the last 3 days, I believe, they, during the course of our and their campaign over almost a month, taken out about 2/3 of Iran's ballistic missile launchers. Now, that's a significant accomplishment, but it's the other number. 1/3 of the ballistic missile launchers remain intact. The Houthi ability to launch missiles was targeted by us, by Israel, U.S. Navy, through hundreds of millions of dollars of sophisticated weaponry against mobile launchers until President Trump declared a separate peace. As long as U.S. targets were not hit, you can go to town on anybody else, and walked away from it because the Navy couldn't afford to keep up that fight. It was asymmetrical. I am not convinced that any continued kinetic campaign can reduce strategically Iran's ability to keep the strait closed. Well, why can't you just go in with cruisers, with frigates, all the stuff we got afloat, with or without the allies, whoever they may be, and open the strait? Well, here's the reason why. All it takes is a Zodiac inflatable boat with a plastic limpet mine on board to zip in at wave height, as you're masked by the waves, up to a tanker, and you pop a limpet mine on. Doesn't matter if it goes off or not. Doesn't matter if it goes off if it doesn't really do that much damage, and these big ships are very difficult to sink with that. It is the threat that it could happen that is enough to deter shipping through the strait. What if you take the other option, much discussed in the press right now? Those Marine units that are on their way to the Gulf and are still about a week or 10 days away, what if they blockade Kharg Island? That's where 90% of Iran's export capacity is centered. What if they take Kharg Island? The Marines land. Our warriors seize something. Always a good image. They can do it. Absolutely, they can do it. It is not just this institute's assessment. It is the almost universal consensus of Iranian analysts that Iran's response will be fine. Now, here's what our target set will include. And their ability to inflict pain on the Gulf exceeds our ability through either seizure or blockade of Kharg to impact their policy behaviors. Once again, how can that be the case? They've lost 90% of their current land-based export capacities. It's because the regime, and the opposite case here is Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. It's just the parallels are striking. You can't win militarily. Ukraine actually is the militarily dominant party on their own territory. But you in Russia are endlessly patient. You have an endless capacity to absorb pain, economic, social, literal pain in terms of losses. And you can keep this going because the rest of the world is impatient, unwilling to accept pain the way you are, and sooner or later, you're going to outlast them. That is Putin's fundamental calculation after that first summer of the Ukraine war, when he realized he couldn't do a military victory, he had to attrit civil infrastructure. The Iranians are convinced they will outlast Donald Trump. They will outlast the Gulf states who do not want to see a ragged, messy end to this conflict that leaves Iran in a threatening position. They'll outlast them all because the resiliency of the security state, the hard men who now absolutely govern Iran, President declared he was successful in effecting regime change, one of his critical objectives in Iran, or at least at a point a critical objective. And indeed, he has produced a change in the regime. You now have absolute security hardliners in control without the veneer except for the possible functional, nobody knows, role of Mujtaba Khamenei, not seen, not heard from, not photographed since he became the supreme leader. Yeah, you effected a change, but a change in the wrong direction. They are convinced they're going to outlast everybody. And so, Ken, we'll get to the what if. What if this ends in a messy fashion, which is, the president does something dramatic, Karg, something in the strait itself, uh, and the Iranians don't respond. And the president says, well, we destroyed the Navy, the Air Force, the air defense system. The ballistic missile program is hugely set back. So's the nuclear enrichment research program. And all of those are factually correct. They've all been done. No, there's no mistake there. I've done my job. It's over to everybody else now to take this on because it's not our strait. We don't need that oil. I doubt the president is aware of the helium, aluminum, fertilizer issues and where that fits into global markets, including the impact on the United States of all of that. But he backs away. What's wrong with that? Strait opens again. There are no more attacks on Gulf states. And by the way, I do not assess that Israel, that Netanyahu, once the president has definitively ended the U.S. campaign, will unilaterally continue an Israeli campaign. Lebanon, different issue entirely. There'll be no interference there, but not in Iran. The president has the agency here. The problem here is Iran emerges stronger. Why? Because the U.S. and Israel threw everything they had at Iran for a prolonged period of time, and the regime didn't just survive, but it's now demonstrated, without a nuclear weapon, without even the threat of a nuclear weapon, their conventional weaponry was enough to close the strait, and that was a proposition. All of us analyzed, and I put myself in the guilty category here. We did not believe that was a probable outcome to a conflict. We were wrong because Iran had shifted from a forward defense strategy to an almost instantaneous horizontal escalation offensive strategy that included closure of the strait. We did not see that, or we didn't assume the triggers would be present as quickly as they were for it. Our error. But it's now established fact. This is the paradox of how do you bring this to a close that does not leave Iran in a much more powerful demonstrated position than it was when this all started.
And this is an incredibly important point. When it comes to the strait, it does not take enormous military force to close it. In fact, you got to think about the timeline for when ship traffic actually ground to a halt. It was initially on the heels of the global insurance industry stating, wait a minute, there's a real conflict here. There's a real risk of damage occurring to traffic through the strait. And so we are going to suspend wartime, anything related to wartime risk. We're not going to cover it. Ship traffic ground to an utter halt. And then all you had to have was one attack that ended up, they killed 2 people or injured 5, right? And the entire maritime industry ground to a complete halt through the region. Because all you have to do is demonstrate a credible threat. That is literally it. And then it becomes something that is a completely different paradigm, and you're not covered for it, not gonna engage. If Iran emerges stronger with the ability to continue to flex and control traffic through the strait, it will get more expensive to move through the strait, without a doubt. You'll actually see inflationary effects on commodities of all kinds, not just oil and gas, but everything. Anything that's trying to traverse is going to have to pay a toll effectively. What that looks like could just be higher freight rates. It could be direct payments to the Iranian regime. It could be any number of things, but they're all inflationary.
And by the way, the strait, like all straits, channels, narrow passages around the world, they're governed by international maritime law and practice, and only rarely by unique bilateral agreement. Iran is not, quote, sovereign, close quote, over that 20 to 30 mile passage. There are agreed passageways in and out for shipping. It is an international passageway, which under international law, except under certain circumstances, must be kept open for innocent passage. That's the term of art. You can close these things in times of war. Strait of Tiran, between what is now Saudi Arabia and the Sinai, that's been closed in the past, but it's not the sovereign property of either Egypt or Saudi Arabia. Iran is asserting now a right to extract tolls, to direct a specific channel of passage through the strait outside the normal shipping lanes. That's in contravention of international law.
It is, absolutely, and there's no doubt about that. But it doesn't change the facts on the ground that Iran has been emboldened to exercise this.
Exactly, and that's the new world we'll find ourselves.
So to think about a world where that is not what unfolds, it basically pulls you into a reality where this conflict doesn't end quickly. Pulls you, I think, into a reality where there is vested interest not just by the U.S. and Israel, but by other parties in the Gulf region for the safe passage of commodities to ensure that we can go back to a world where international maritime law is honored. And I think that's where this gets incredibly difficult. Now, I want to put one thing on the table, because in terms of U.S. exit, I think there is a willingness to engage that will come to a very hard end once we get to May. And you might ask why. It has to do with domestic politics. So there are 3 weekends every year where U.S. drivers get in their cars and drive more than any other weekend. It's Memorial Day weekend, July 4th weekend, and Labor Day weekend. Imagine a world where this conflict drags, gets worse, prices at the pump go up to north of $4.55 for an average sort of regular gallon of gasoline, and we're in the heart of summer driving season. Do you think that bodes well for the president's interests in the Republican Party in November? Not at all. Imagine a world where you can negotiate a strategy where commodity starts to flow out of the region, oil prices soften somewhat in May before summer driving season actually hits, and everybody gets in their cars and goes about life like they always have. Now the president can put a very different picture on everything, and it's one that a lot of people in the general public will accept because it's not hitting them in the pocketbooks during summer vacation. I think this has a really, really strong resonance.
Ken, as a shifting now to political analysis as opposed to market, it's absolutely possible, but I believe we will need to go through another escalation, another paroxysm, another flex of warrior force before it is demonstrated that, messy as it will be, an exit is indeed required from all this. And that brings us to my final comment. Are the present negotiations, in quotes, actually negotiations? Are they exchanges of paper points, largely through the Pakistanis, or something else? Are they intended, second question, to actually produce an agreed outcome, or is it buying time a la Geneva negotiations for another military action? As I said, there is a calendar for the arrival of the Marine units in place in the Gulf and their supportive kit and cover. I can't answer either of those two definitively, except to say the 15 points, as I have seen them, that have been presented to Iran are classic U.S. government policy points. Wouldn't change a word of them. They have been our policy views for a very long period of time. Nothing new. What's the Iranian 5-point response? Sovereignty acknowledged over the strait, reparations, closure of U.S. bases in the area, no attacks by any party, read Israel, on the proxies. All of that has to stop. Gaza, Yemen, the Houthis, and Hezbollah in Lebanon. These are not reasonable negotiating points, but it shows the position of strength Iran sees itself in at present. So I think you need to buckle in over the next 10 days, 2 weeks, for something other than negotiations taking place wherever it may be, Islamabad, Vienna, somewhere, to come to an agreement on paper to bring this to a close. I hope that's the case. I hope there is, in fact, a diplomatic way out. But I don't see that until another demonstration of what I assess will be a failed attempt to kinetically pressure Iran takes place. This has been Baker Briefing, where we make the news make sense. The podcast is brought to you by the Baker Institute, which delivers nonpartisan policy research on the most pressing issues facing the United States, Texas, and the world. Share your feedback at bakerbriefing@rice.edu. This episode was produced by Shannon Moriarty with AV production by Kevin Young. Additional production support was provided by Leslie Marie Aguiar, Ed Bailey, and Victoria Jupp. See our other podcasts, latest research, and events at bakerinstitute.org. Thanks for joining us.